Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our next session in the Managerial Insights series. We're pleased that you're joining us today. My name is Angie Brown, and I am the Managing Director for Executive Education at the Darla Moore School of Business. This series was formed to reach our business community during this crisis to help businesses survive and emerge stronger. The series is a collaboration between Executive Education at the Moore School and the South Carolina Business Review with Mike Switzer. Mike joins us today and will be facilitating the questions and answer session at the end. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Gerald McDermott from our Department of International Business. Gerry will be discussing the impact of international trade and investment on South Carolina and will be sharing his knowledge and insights during this time of uncertainty. You'll be able to ask questions at the end of Gerry's presentation by using the chat button found at the bottom of your screen. So just send your question in using the chat button and Mike will read your question to Gerry. We are recording today's session, which will be available on our website tomorrow or Wednesday. So be sure to check it out there and feel free to share it with others. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Gerry and you'll be in good hands. Take it away, Gerry.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks so much, Angie, and also to the Executive Education Group over at the Darla Moore School of Business for putting this all together, this great series over the past month and a half, and also, of course, to Mike Switzer at the South Carolina Business Review. So I'm going to jump in with I'm going to hit the share screen, and bear with me for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So give me one sec. And here I go. All right. And Angie, do you see that okay? You're my test.
Yes.
All right. Here we go. Okay, we're all good? All right. So this is, the talk is really about how South Carolina has internationalized itself, and then why, how that may matter going forward, especially given the COVID crisis. So, and one of the things I want to do is help us make that connection between being internationally competitive in both the sell side and the investment side, but also how do you become competitive and how do you maintain that position and advance it? And particularly the connection between that competitiveness and how we think about skills and technological development. Skills and technological development. So here's a little bit of a summary of what you can anticipate in the next 20 minutes. One of the things that people may not realize, and I'm going to show you some data, is that South Carolina really has become one of the most internationalized states in the United States, in the Union, particularly in terms of its economy, right? It's always now, for the last 10, 15, or 15 years, among the top 5 states in terms of, for instance, foreign direct investment. I'm going to use my cursor, hope you see that. So that's direct investment, meaning brick and mortar, investing in building a factory or locating a business, a whole business there. In terms of international trade, exports and imports, what we sell into the world, what we also buy from the world. And then related is how many jobs it's created, or those two actions create in South Carolina. So as a percentage of our economy, of our workforce, these things, international foreign direct investment and international trade, are really important. So I'm going to show you a couple of trends along those lines. This is obviously prior to the current crisis. And then we're going to say, well, what would that mean for our economy here in South Carolina? And then think about some other things. Who's winning and losing, really? We'll try to take a pretty close look at that and pay particular attention to small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, because that's really the backbone of any economy. And I'll explain a little bit about that later. We're going to find out that SMEs are really important in South Carolina, as with the neighboring states, but they're not capturing value added enough, especially compared to the neighbors. That is a really big concern for me and for anybody doing work on economic development and competitiveness. How would we improve that? How do we change that? But what also does the current state of affairs, that is, this increased nationalism and this problem of the COVID crisis, how is that going to impact South Carolina? So here's a nice little map I borrowed from the American Enterprise Institute. And what you could see down here on the right-hand side is, yeah, there it is. South Carolina is either usually number 5 or tied for 5. It's among always the top states in terms of total trade as a percentage of the state GDP. What's really important in that number is that about half of that percentage is exports. That is, exports are 15% of GDP in this of the economy, essentially. So international sales, not sales to other states, but outside of the country, are really important. That's a big number compared to other countries. Where do we export to? This is really important because we have to think about our geopolitical relationships in the world. Not surprising, really interesting. Look at that line that's been really ascending here. That's China. China is a major buyer of goods from South Carolina. And notice that since 2016, when the trade tension started, that's been dipping. Who are the other leaders? The leaders of the EU and NAFTA, right? Mexico and Canada. And also, if you look at some of the data in recent years, Japan's very strong buyer of South Carolina goods, as well as recently the UAE. They've been buying Boeing airplanes particularly. So I'm not going to go into the minutia here. What do we export? What are our biggest exports and products that we sell? We sell some services, but in terms of manufacturing, which is the biggest component, it's mainly in transportation and chemicals. Not surprising. Aircraft, cars from BMW, now Volvo too, and all those key components and systems, as well as chemicals, things like rubber and all different applications. So that's what we sell into the world, right? And that's very important. Now, what's another part of internationalization is what we call foreign direct investment. So in general, this is a potential problem, but an opportunity for South Carolina. South Carolina doesn't have a lot of its own big firms. We have Sunoco. I am part of the Sunoco International Business Department. But outside of that, not a lot of really local big firms. It is among the consistently top 10 states in the United States for interstate capital investments. That is, companies from other parts of the United States investing here. But it's also usually one of the top 5 states in the United States over the last 15 to 20 years for attracting foreign direct investment, right? And we've gotten about $50 billion in foreign direct investment into South Carolina over the last 15 years. And notice that it accounts for about or over 8% of private sector workforce, which is one of the high, if not the highest in the United States. So in the last 10 years alone, FDI has increased, and the jobs it's created has increased by 40%. We're seeing over 140,000 jobs created directly. And who is doing that? A lot of there's a very close relationship between the export countries and the investors. So I'm going to show you something here. For instance, look at that graph. It's just an example, but the numbers are pretty consistent over the last 10 to 15 years. Germany, France, Japan. Also, China is actually investing more and more. United Kingdom, Canada. What does that tell you? The EU and NAFTA countries and Japan are the biggest investors. Another way to look at jobs directly and indirectly from trade as well is this number. There's a claim that it's about 500,000 jobs created or in South Carolina are supported by trade. That's imports and exports. What? Now you can see that's like 20% of private sector employment right now. That's a big number. That's a very big number for a state, especially if you think about the history of South Carolina. Here's another set of some interesting data over here. What sectors? A lot of trade distribution, but also a lot of manufacturing. And again, this is about FDI. Most of it's manufacturing. So you got a perspective there about that we're selling a lot into the world, and we're also attracting a lot of investment from the world into South Carolina. In fact, we're one of the top 5 consistently on these issues. But the question now is, who benefits and why is this important to us? So one way to think about who benefits is what we call spillovers, positive spillovers. So it's not just that you have the actual investment of that company, but that company, through employment, training, through gaining local suppliers, it creates positive economic spillovers. And it diffuses also new ideas, new learning, new technologies throughout the region. That would be the ideal situation. A good example is our friends up at the upstate at BMW. And if you look at some of the reports, particularly done by my colleagues over at the Darla Moore School of Business Division of Research, headed by Doug Woodward and Joey Van Nessen, what they've seen a big spillover potential. Why? What's going on? Well, one interesting thing is 80% of the vehicles created at BMW are actually exported. Usually that means more money. Second is that a lot of suppliers are in South Carolina. That's really important. That creates another economic multiplier effect. Lastly, they estimate that for every 1 job in BMW, 10 more are created indirectly through the supply chain. That's a great effect. Now, a big question is whether that's the norm or is that the exception? And more research is being done on this about the whole Southeast. And this is a big issue. So for instance, we could look at BMW and say, this is going to be amazing. A big debate right now about Boeing is whether it's going to also spur more and more suppliers into the state. Same thing as Volvo, right? Hire in Camden hasn't done that. Now the question is, well, why? And how does this also affect our local firms, the SMEs, the small, medium-sized firms? What you can see here is that South Carolina, like its neighbors, and remember, its neighbors are nice guys, but they're also our competitors. About half of our economy is employed or created by small and medium-sized firms. Really, that's the backbone of any economy, anywhere in the world, right? And what do? Most of it's in manufacturing and logistics, and a lot of it also is in science and technology services, okay? But look at this graph. This is a concern for me. So I want to show you, look at the cursor where I've highlighted South Carolina. Now what you can see is that 84% of all firms that export are small, medium-sized firms. That's great. That's an amazing, and you can see that's about on par with our neighbors over here in North Carolina, Georgia, even in Tennessee. Tennessee is really important because that has good automotive and manufacturing as well. So does Alabama now. What concerns me is this column where it says SME export value. What that says is, what is the share of value that's being created what share of that is going back to small and medium-sized firms in South Carolina? Only 10%. So 84% of exporters are small and medium-sized firms, but they're only capturing 10% of the value. Now, why is that a big concern too? If you look at our neighbors, and not just North Carolina with the Research Triangle, but you look at other ones, Georgia, Tennessee, even Alabama, what you can see is small and medium-sized firms are capturing more value. This is a really big concern of mine. And it would be if you analyze any country, actually, or any part of the United States. Because that says that, on the one hand, the small and medium-sized firms in South Carolina may be underperforming or they're getting boxed out. On the other hand, you could say, hey, that's a great opportunity, right? So let's start to think about that problem from a couple of different perspectives. Well, the first is the immediate crisis that we're in. Now, what have we seen over the last few years? One is that we have this world of maybe increased nationalism or populism leading to trade wars that we know, right? That our President Trump has initiated to a certain degree. Okay, so we're having tensions with China. You can see that was a big buyer of our goods. Tensions with the EU, another big buyer of our goods, etc. So that obviously would have a negative impact on South Carolina, right? Now that first part is an interesting question about that impact. It impacts South Carolina negatively in two ways. If you go look at that data that I showed you before. One is clearly export sales, right? We're going to sell less to the world. We'll make less money potentially. But our export capability in many ways is connected to those investments of foreign direct investment. So we have to be very, very conscious of the fact that trade wars also impact us in the level of investments. Now, what's the other concern that everybody has, of course? Why are we doing this video, right? Zoom. It's because of COVID. Now, COVID disruption is definitely not good. It's not going to be good for anybody and the economy. But there's an interesting effect that's taking place, and that is the re-regionalization of global value chains. Now, it's not happening in an incredibly quick process, but it actually started, I'd say, more than 5 years ago, according to a lot of the data. Essentially, global supply chains got overextended by trying to be really global. There's a fallacy of trying to be global. We can go into that later if you're interested. And there are a lot smarter people on that issue who are participating in this Zoom webinar who probably have a better answer than I do about that. But that's happening. But as things get re-regionalized into North America, South Carolina is very well positioned to capture some of that value, right? What are those types of goods? Advanced manufacturing, really good. Certain types of key science and technology services, that's again what we can do. We could be really good. So as that happens, we have to start thinking strategically how we could capture that back. Now, is that going to be good or bad for our small, medium-sized firms, our friends that we talked about before? Well, we saw that they were not capturing enough value. What makes me concerned about that is that when you look at any research about economic growth and innovation around the world, any regions, SME dynamism is a key part of that story. It also has a huge impact on just economic and social welfare. So for instance, you may be thinking there is a relationship about the vibrancy of the SME sector and overall levels of poverty and distribution of wealth. And you know that that's been a big issue also in the history of South Carolina. So how can SMEs produce more value-added exports and capture more value added as suppliers, even to the big multinational companies in South Carolina, essentially taking advantage of what BMW, Volvo, Boeing, Samsung, what they all do. How can you do both? Well, I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm going to end it on this point, a couple ideas about education. Now, what does it mean? We all know that we want to improve education. Everybody says we're going to improve education. In South Carolina, we all know that we haven't done a great job of that over the decades. In general terms, in the quality of our education, we've been ranked towards the bottom. But besides, and it's no important, like, I don't want to underestimate the importance of investing into primary and secondary education. That's clearly important. But sometimes we overlook the connection, the vital importance of the connection between industry and higher education institutions. And here I mention it in these three ways: R&D institutions, technology extension, and training. Those are what I call the trifecta of sustained value creation, right? Now, these institutions are public-private constellations, and we have to think about how they can work better, how we can invest into them more, and how we can connect them to key issues of industry development. So for instance, how do we think about our universities? We have a great university, University of South Carolina, that I'm a part of, and many of people in the participating today are part of. But are we doing the best in connecting that university or and what we have to offer to industry, to thinking about innovation, technological change? For instance, I saw in the crowd, there's Dirk Brown. Professor Dirk Brown is out there in our virtual crowd, and he runs a great institute on these issues. He's thinking about that a lot, okay? But what has happened? South Carolina is becoming known as a state that is cutting its appropriations on a per capita basis towards higher education. It's actually one of the biggest cutters. What are the other components? Technology extension and workforce development or training. On the one hand, technology extension comes in all different forms. I'm going to give you one quick example: the manufacturing extension partnerships around the United States. Another member of our crowd here is Professor Andrew Schrank from Brown University. He's written about these great centers, and he's done some wonderful work on these. We should be doing more with we only have one in South Carolina. Maybe we could take that as a model and do a lot more with it. The other key component is training. We've heard a lot about our great community college and technical college system that we developed in South Carolina. Jermaine Wills is one of the leaders of this in the upstate. He's in the crowd today. But I'm a little concerned, particularly in that area, because that's really where the rubber hits the road. What has happened? Since 2008 financial crisis, we haven't even returned to the levels that we were spending as a state. State apportions, this is how you look at it, the data. You look at state apportions, appropriations, on a per capita, like a per student basis to the system. Our competitor states have rebounded. Let me show you. So you can see this line here, that South Carolina is going, after it was going down, it was holding, and then it went down again, right? But we're getting more and more people coming into the system. What you can see is it went down a bit in North Carolina, and then it started to come back up. Georgia went down sharply and then came right back up. It's actually higher than where it was. Let me show you something very important. This gives you an idea. Now, we've increased it over the last few years, our spending on technical colleges and the two-year colleges, the community colleges. That's really our technical training system, workforce training. But you can also see our competitors are outspending us, and they're probably more effective, right? Louisiana is the only one who's a bit behind. But why is that? Look at that. Tennessee is a key state in automotive advanced manufacturing. We need to really try to compete with them. Alabama is capturing more and more investments in the automotive advanced manufacturing sector too. They're spending more. Georgia's spending more. Now, I'm not just saying we're going to spend, but we have to think of this as investments. This is what you do. If you're thinking about how do I attract investments, how do I capture more value added and innovate more, you think about how do I spend my money as a good investment. So moving forward, I think this is a moment, actually, when South Carolina, like many other states, are going to be really reassessing where they fit in the world. And they're going to have to rethink what is their strategy, what can we do better. And I think it really starts with this point first. We really are an international economy. We're a leader in that in the United States. How do we become more of a leader and capture even more value added, particularly in certain advanced services and advanced manufacturing? That's going to be the big thing. And why is that so important and where's the opportunity? COVID is a big problem, but that is forcing companies all around the world to rethink their supply chains and where they're investing. And that means that's an opportunity for us and our small, medium-sized firms. So thank you. And Mike, I turn it over to you and we can take questions.
Okay. So we got to turn things back on now. That was great, Gerry. A lot of good information there. Let me remind everybody to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to send in any questions that you have for Gerry on the presentation today. And I have one for you. And maybe we do need to go back to the slide that you had on the SME percent of exports value, where you were showing a lot of concern about the small, medium-sized enterprises in our state not getting their fair share of the business compared to our neighboring states and of the export business. And so I guess my question is could this at all be impacted by Boeing and the billion-dollar airplanes that they export? It kind of skews that percentage. Is that possible?
That may be the case, but actually that's a trend we see if we go back in time. So we see that was already 10 years ago before the Boeing. I think that is a big issue. But a lot of this discussion, Mike, there's two ways to think about it. Is that Boeing's so big, so it's going to capture more value. But part of it is this: what do they do at Boeing, right? So BMW internalized a lot of its manufacturing and value creation in the very beginning too. And it brought in valuable parts and assembled them upstate. And as it got confident in what it was doing with its strategy, it also learned about the region, and there are more and more suppliers. So it would be able to shift a lot of that responsibility more and more to other firms. So what we want to see is something like, and with Boeing, that the Charleston plant isn't just a pure assembly plant, right? We want to see it developing over time more and more supplier relations in the region and with South Carolina firms. And I guess that's what I would say is that's the question we should be asking them. So it's good that they're here. Okay, now what's next? What can we do to really grow that supplier base in South Carolina?
Well, speaking of that supplier base, there's a company in the upstate I noticed that is a supplier, I believe, to Boeing that just announced they were going to have to close.
Yeah, I mean, those are the really big concerns as to why would they close? What's going on with Boeing that would make them close, or is it a question of the state? Those are that's sort of like phase two. That's really where the game is won and lost for a state like South Carolina. Okay, but notice, Mike, one thing I want to again point out: have I been talking about tax breaks for gaining your investment? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking essentially about public and private actors co-investing into value creating assets.
All right, we have a question that's come in on the chat, and let me say that again. If anybody has any questions, please use the chat function at the bottom. And let's see, the first one is, let me bring it back up here. We are starting to get some to come in now. Gerry, this is great, and I buy the policy recommendations, but what are the partisan politics of this in a low tax, low spend state that's gotten where it's gotten via laissez-faire issues, not public investment of the sort you recommend?
Okay, so what I'm working on this with a couple of colleagues now, and the suspicion is that where the gains, some critical gains have been made, it's about these types of investments. So if you look at what's been going on workforce development in the upstate, it's very fascinating, that whole system around BMW in terms of apprenticeship programs and technical training, right? So what I would first say is the gains are not all about those tax breaks, right? So the evidence would point otherwise. And I think, that's really where the big politics is, right? The so-called partisan politics, or the red-blue politics. Some of this, I think most of this cuts across the divide, right? So one of the things to look at is Tennessee. Now, Tennessee is still a right-to-work state, though that is sort of gradually loosening up. But what's fascinating about Tennessee is to see how much they, nonetheless, a really Republican-controlled state in many ways at the state level, they're investing into a lot of these areas, right? Just like we talk about. So if they're doing it, if Georgia's really been working with its workforce training budgets and investments over the last 3 or 4 years in a very new way. Wow. I didn't know that, Georgia politically is that much different from South Carolina. So I think this is really a rather pragmatic and practical issue than a partisan issue too.
All right, here's another question. All comparisons that you gave today were per capita or per student, but what about in absolute terms? This is also perhaps an important perspective. Wonder if South Carolina is at a disadvantage because of lack of emphasis on excellence in artificial intelligence and related computational areas.
Wow, that's a tough question. Wow. We're really pulling out the techno wizards and the people who really work on technology. Okay, so so size would only matter in terms of scale, and so the question is, like, does AI and computer science research and training actually demand a minimum scale? And South Carolina just doesn't have that scale, and I would say no. Obviously, you need wealth. But, there's a lot of examples of small countries and poor countries working their ways up to these high technologies. So I don't think it's about size as much as where they're putting their investments. That's really a policy decision too. So for instance, on AI and computer science, there's enough examples out there of good examples and bad examples about how the state works with its leading universities first to think about that. Where's our role? Because it's not going, something like that is so massive, it's not going to be a pure private play or a pure state play. And what you're trying to do is attract certain types of investments to work with the university, for instance, in their computer science. That would be an example. So those are the type of, that's the sort of strategic approach you would want to take. So like AI is just not going to come about because you have a great business school and you have low taxes. That just doesn't happen.
Okay, we have another question. You mentioned that in terms of state appropriations for technical education, South Carolina ranks very low. How do we compare in terms of overall appropriations? For example, we do tuition, and this, I'm assuming this is this person's company, does tuition reimbursement for our employees as other companies do. And so what about that type of funding? Is that counted in the overall?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a specialist in the education area. And the documents I've reviewed, that's a very important issue on the tuition side. So that is, that's a big debate. And for instance, in South Carolina, about, well, is the percentage of that what the state contributes, say, to the University of South Carolina or SC State or Clemson, that's also separate from subsidized tuition or lottery tuition and things like that, which eventually goes into. But most states keep those things separate. Okay, and you obviously tuition monies are important, but knowing that you have this budget that is committed over time in investing into certain things, that's a big signal, because what happens is it signals to other actors about the expectations, right? And if I see Mike Switzer really committing and his people to something that I'm interested in, then I'm more willing to invest long term into that.
And I imagine most states, companies, they're in all different states that, these companies all do tuition reimbursement everywhere, not just in South Carolina.
Right. That's yeah, I meant to say that so it's like it's a wash almost, right?
Right. And let me remind everybody, we've got a few minutes left. If you've got a question, please send it through the chat function. And so what's your overall feel for our international trade, foreign investment coming out of this, whether it takes a year, 2 or 3, with the COVID situation? We were being referred to, as Governor Haley said, the beast of the Southeast. Are we going to remain the beast of the Southeast?
Yeah, that's a really good question, difficult question. And Mike, it's related to a question that somebody texted me directly. And it was about, is there, and maybe I didn't make this clear, is there actually a problem with the model? That is, the model relies too much, particularly on foreign firms, and foreign firms are maybe very sensitive to decreasing their investment or pulling out altogether over a certain period of time. And that's the sort of related to the beast of the Southeast, right? Because the model in many ways did rely on attracting foreign direct investment. So I think my point about foreign direct investment, about the model, is, okay, that was the model that was developed. And it's a good start in terms of some interesting possibilities, but it's not going to be sustainable, I think, unless the roots of those technologies and supply chains and value chains get deeper and more spread out through the state. What does that mean? Essentially, that the benefits and the value creation are with local firms. They may be getting big firms. They could grow. I'm not saying that all firms have to be small. But if we don't think about how we're going to constantly increase the value creation inside the state by local firms, then we decline over time. There's someone always around willing to undercut you, to take those investments away, to take those export markets away from you. So how do you stay ahead, Mike? You always have to be constantly investing into value creation, the workforce training, the R&D, the technological extension systems. That's the big thing. That's where you're going to win and lose the game.
Okay, we do have a few more questions that rolled in. With the latest rhetoric from the administration on China and the potential strain that this may have on phase 2 negotiations, can you speak to the potential impact this may have on South Carolina's significant trade relationship with the country and ways to mitigate potential hits due to global politics?
Wow, that's the other side to this. So China, for instance, is very important to South Carolina, okay? how does so in a way, how does a small state try to impact Washington and big geopolitical issues? And there are models out there. One is to think of it this way. It's like the strategy of what we say the Netherlands does in the EU. And the Netherlands is really creative. What it does is it figures out how it can play a role that's really valuable to Germany. So in a way, South Carolina has to be an important active player in those relationships, say between the United States and China, and demonstrate that to both sides. And I think at the same time, there's a coalition there, right? There are other states that are really, in the case of China as an example, or the EU could it be, there are other states in the United States that really have important relationships with China, for instance, as well. And it's not crazy for those state governors to actually talk to one another, to think about the big picture that they have in common and say, hey, look, we're players too. How can we be part of this big geopolitical game to help resolve these problems and these disputes?
And what should be the next priority for SMEs to do in South Carolina?
You mean, well, in terms of technologies, I gather that's what is being discussed. I don't know what, if I knew what the best next thing is to invest in, I wouldn't be an academic. I'd be making money. We could talk to Dirk Brown about that one day. But based on my understanding of South Carolina, what do we see? I think advanced manufacturing areas, there's a lot of great foundations in South Carolina for that. And that can apply to many different actual product areas. And I think we're also playing more and more an important role in terms of new fuel type. There's some very interesting investments that have been going on for years and years and years to think about not just cars, but the whole alternative fuel economies. The USC as well as Clemson has made important investments into this. We're really going to become a leader in the world on logistics. And there's some very interesting services going on, of course, healthcare services and healthcare related manufacturing. That is also equipment, but also the manufacturing of certain type of drugs, things like that.
And one last question, it looks like, shift away from manufacturing topic. And this person writes, Charlotte is obviously a financial hub, and Atlanta too as well, but of course Charlotte right on our border. Could you see Greenville, Columbia, Charleston ever pulling large financial institutions away from Charlotte or Atlanta?
Financial institutions, I don't know. I'm not a specialist in that, and I haven't seen that Columbia, for instance, or Greenville has any specific unique financial capabilities or institutions. I think something that is interesting that is getting overlooked in the world, and that is the financing of dynamic SMEs. We have this bank consolidation process in the United States for a number of reasons that actually started in '98, right? And where the interesting opportunity, if you look at dynamic SME sectors, is usually SMEs have very particular sort of financial needs. And I always wondered in the Southeast, who are the banks? What are the financial institutions taking care of those actors? That's something that should be that new medium-sized banking institutions should be able to attack in terms of stealing away from Wells Fargo, Bank of America, things like that, the big companies like that.
Well, Gerry, that is going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time today and for your insight. And let me also remind everybody that the next segment in this series starts on Wednesday morning with the South Carolina Business Review radio show, when I will be interviewing Doug Quackenboss, who is a lecturer in the marketing department at the Moore School. And he is going to be talking about selling in a post-COVID world and how the sales process is being reinvented. So that is across South Carolina's 8 public radio stations at 10 till 8 in the morning on Wednesday. And of course, it's a podcast also, which you can subscribe to and listen anytime. And then the following Monday, a week from today, we will be doing the Zoom with Doug. Angie, back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gerry, Mike, and everybody for joining us today. It's very interesting and informative, and appreciate everyone's time. Again, Gerry's PowerPoint slide will be emailed to everyone, and today's session that was recorded will be available on our website later this week. So as Mike mentioned, we have another session beginning with an interview on this upcoming Wednesday with Doug Quackenboss, and then a Zoom meeting next Monday on the 22nd at 3, and we hope you can join us. Until then, thank you very much for joining us, and stay well, everyone.